Welcome to this rapid revision video looking at 18th and 19th century crimes. We'll be focusing on changing continuity. Firstly, some background. The period from 1700 to 1900 saw a lot of big changes in society. This was the era of the Industrial Revolution, with new ways of living and working. There was mass migration from the countryside into the towns and cities. Poverty led to the growth of a criminal underclass in urban society. The ways in which the law was enforced and criminals punished changed. Politicians and important individuals introduced important reforms, such as the first professional police forces. In this video, we will focus on key types of crime and how this showed change and continuity. For ease of understanding, I'm going to highlight the changes in red and continuities in blue. So let's get into it. Firstly, smuggling. Let's have a look at some changes. During the 17th and 18th centuries, more imported goods began to be taxed, including cloth, wine and alcoholic spirits. Smugglers imported these goods without paying these duties. In the 18th century, smugglers got more organised. Gangs like the Hawkhurst Gang, named after Hawkhurst in Kent where they were first organised, controlled long stretches of the south coast. This made it very difficult for the authorities to tackle them. The Hawkhurst Gang was active between 1735 and 1749, and ended with the execution of its two leaders, Arthur Gray and Thomas Kingsmill. However, other gangs popped up, and the government found it hard to control them. Smuggling was considered a social crime, much as it had been before. Those that benefited from lower prices would not turn the smugglers in. Many local people were directly or indirectly involved, keeping a lookout for the customs men, unloading cargoes, etc., and also passing on the untaxed goods. Smugglers operated in remote areas at night, and that made them hard to find with the law authorities available at the time, and all those things are continuity. However, one change is that smugglers often use more extreme violence and firearms to threaten people or drive off the customs men. The taxes and duties introduced by the government incentivised smugglers and those that bought their goods from them. In this respect, some historians argue that smuggling was a crime created by the government, albeit inadvertently. Smuggling began to decline not because of punishments or a crackdown on it, but because it became less necessary for turning a profit. Pitt the Younger's government lowered import duties, making the price difference between legitimate and smuggled goods far less. This meant that many people didn't consider the risk of arrest worthwhile for the money saved. Smuggling gradually reduced. Another crime showing some change in continuity was highway robbery. Robbing people travelling along Britain's many remote roads had been a common crime ever since medieval times. Those robbing people on foot were called footpads, those on horseback were known as highwaymen. However, there was some change. Highway robbery increased in the 18th century. Here are some reasons. The countryside remained remote, and migration to cities made it even more so. It was easy for highwaymen to operate. The growth in turnpike roads meant that more people were travelling, and their movements became more predictable with scheduled coach services. The increase in trade meant that there were more valuable items and more cash being transported on the roads, so this was rich pickings for robbers. Today, and in the fictional stories of the time even, highwaymen sometimes had a glamorous, even romantic image. But the reality is very different, and we're going to look at the reality now. Unlike smuggling, society always treated highway robbery as a serious crime with real victims. It disrupted post and communications, it disrupted trade and travel, and it occurred on the King's highways, undermining the government's grip on law and order. As a result, and here's a change, the death penalty was introduced for anyone found armed and in disguise on the highways in 1772, aiming as a deterrent towards highway robbery. Mounted patrols also helped to deter highwaymen. However, modern banking systems that no longer required large amounts of cash to be physically transported did a lot to make highway robbery less profitable. The last recorded highway robbery was in 1831. So why are there some positive attitudes towards highway robbers? Despite the brutality and violence of their offences, some highwaymen became famous, or rather notorious celebrities. Jack Sheppard was one such highwayman. Sheppard was arrested and escaped 4 times. Some people enjoyed hearing about his escapades and, despite his criminality, backed the villain as an underdog who was mocking the establishment. When he was hanged at Tyburn in 1724, a huge crowd gathered. They threw flowers and pubs gave out free pints of ale. There was a real party atmosphere. Plays were written to celebrate his adventures until these were banned and censored. In fiction, characters like Dick Turpin remain glamorous, if inaccurate, portrayals of highwaymen. For these people are not Robin Hood characters who are stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. So what explains their popularity? Well, part of it may come down to the fact that these were simply exciting adventure stories and people did like them. But the reality of highway robbery was not popular, even if the stories were entertaining. Another crime showing change in continuity was poaching. Like smuggling, poaching remained common and was still treated as a social crime. People didn't much care if the hungry were taking animals for the pot from the land of the rich, or at least the poor didn't, so they would rarely report poachers. Also like smuggling though, there was an increase in larger, more sophisticated and more organised gangs poaching. This led to the passing in 1723 of what became known as the Black Act. This law made poaching a capital offence. In other words, you could be hanged for poaching. It also became illegal to disguise oneself in a hunting area by blackening the face, typically with coal dust. This is why it became known as the Black Act. Ownership of snares and hunting dogs could result in fines and prison sentences. Although less draconian than some of the medieval laws, in some respects these harsh laws were indeed similar to the medieval forest laws. They were widely seen as unfair, especially as anyone with land holdings worth over £100 or more, i.e. the very wealthy, could hunt without restrictions. The Black Act was repealed in 1823 by Robert Peel's reforms. Poaching was illegal, but it did not carry the death sentence from this date. We'll finish with a reminder about witchcraft, something that I covered in much more detail in the previous video. Belief in witchcraft persisted into the middle of the 18th century in more remote and rural areas. However, Enlightenment thinking meant that it was no longer criminalised in the same way. Instead, people who claimed to be witches were considered swindlers and con artists and punished with fines or prison time. However, accusing somebody of magical acts, or therefore accusing someone of witchcraft, was made illegal. Witchcraft was essentially decriminalised by the 1736 Witchcraft Act. Let's sum up our final points. Again, I'll give the main changes in red and the main areas of continuity in blue. The 18th and 19th centuries were the time of the Industrial Revolution. There were many changes in work, society, and where and how people lived. Smuggling remained treated as a social crime by most, but new taxes expanded the appeal of smuggling. Larger organised gangs took part in the activity. Smuggling, though, began to decline as it became less profitable. Highway robbery was a serious and common crime in the 18th century, much as it had been in earlier times. But new roads and an increase in valuables being carried on them made highway robbery more popular. More effective patrols and a decrease in the amount of cash transported saw highway robbery decline in the early 1800s. Some highwaymen became famous and celebrated though. Poaching remained treated as a social crime, a bit like smuggling, and it was rarely reported. But the growth in organised poaching gangs led to the 1723 Black Act that introduced harsh punishments, including the death penalty. The Black Act was repealed in 1823. Witchcraft was decriminalised by the 1736 Witchcraft Act. And that's the end of this video. I hope it's given you everything that you need and that it's been helpful. If it has, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel for more. If there's something else that you're really desperate for me to do a video on, please pop it in the comments below and I'll see what I can do or let you know when it's coming out. But for now, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.